Hello, hello, hello. I'm back after a little bit of a Halloween break, and we are going to finish up Genesis today. Alright, so the final few chapters of Genesis, chapters 42 all the way through 51, detail Joseph's family coming back to Egypt, to ask of him for some measure of grace. There has been a famine in the land, and they need supplies. They need food, they need goods, grain, whatever else they might require to get through the disaster. So they come to him, and strangely enough, he holds back his tears, and he treats them with a sort of like an undeserved, maybe abundant amount of grace. He actually gives them the supplies, and then he doesn't take their money. And he sends them the money, and he sends them back to Jacob, to Israel, to their father. And of course, when they get there, they're worried. They think that something may have gone wrong, and that was like an unlawful trade. So they think they have to go back again, and they have to bring their youngest son, the youngest brother, Benjamin, with them this time at Joseph's request. The father, Jacob / Israel, he's a little bit hesitant. He doesn't want Benjamin to go because he doesn't want to lose Benjamin like he's lost Joseph, so he's worried. Whatever, they end up coming back. Benjamin is there. What ends up happening is, again, Joseph doesn't reveal his identity, and he treats them with grace, and he sends them on their way. However, this time he kind of tricks them. He's placed some gold and silver into the bags of Benjamin, making it look like Benjamin has stolen from them. Then, of course, they are brought back to Egypt by one of, I guess, the officers, and Joseph kind of is like, why would you steal from me, blah, 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 whatever. And then he reveals himself to them, and they have this big, emotional, home welcoming reunion, I guess. They all weep and they cry, and they're like, oh, you're alive, we're sorry, da, 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 da. And then he's like, is my father still alive? Go get my father. And then they bring Jacob / Israel, and they have the big old reunion, and everything's great. And then, of course, there's a genealogy about the families that end up staying in Egypt, because during the famine, Joseph says that the land of Egypt will provide for Jacob and his sons and the offspring and stuff like that. So they do, and so there are all these genealogies that sort of dictate who the people, who the descendants of Israel, of Jacob, are, that end up living in Egypt while they're waiting to return into the land of Canaan. This is where we get introduced to the 12 tribes of Israel, who are named after the 12 sons of Jacob / Israel. And then, of course, each of them has like their own blessing and characteristics that are bestowed upon them and things like that, that the book of Genesis details, which is going to be kind of important moving forward, but we'll retread that as we kind of move through it. But, like Judah is supposed to be the lineage of the rulers, and Joseph has his own characteristics, Benjamin, Simeon, etc., etc., etc. But the thing that I think that was most interesting that I want to focus on here is the kind of, interestingly, like an overturning or a circumventing of the retributive justice, the eye for an eye logic that we will see become instituted further in the law, in the moral law, in Torah through Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But what you get here is you think that there's going to be some sort of retribution for their actions. The brothers who sold Joseph into slavery in Egypt, you think that Joseph's gonna get some kind of revenge, or some measure of recompense is going to befall them, but it doesn't. And Joseph actually has this really famous line towards the end where he says, you meant this for evil, but God meant this for good. There are a lot of different ways, we could think of this as, God's sovereignty, God's providence, etc., etc. We could also think of this as being a way of justifying and establishing how these circumstances create the identity of the Jewish people as they're in captivity in Babylon, writing this as it's being written down by these scribes, and how this helps to explain how it is that these tribes all have their unique positions and identities, and how it is that that the story of Joseph kind of functions in the establishment of those relations, and how important that is. That's obviously important as well. But I think the thing that I find so fascinating is it's not that I wasn't expecting it. I know the story, I know the outcome, but I didn't notice that my own anticipation was, or my own expectations were kind of surprised that there was no retribution here, but there's actually grace upon grace that is bestowed to the brothers, rather than that eye for an eye logic that we will see come. And we do see some measure of eye for an eye earlier in Genesis, when God talks about how when a man's blood is spilled, then man's blood will be taken, sort of thing. But you didn't get that here. And this idea, that this grace that Joseph shows when he says that you meant it for ill, but God meant it for good, is something that I think is really beautiful. And I think it shows a different measure, or a different type of justice, a different type of social relation, a different type of social ethic. And yeah, I don't know, it just, for some reason, it really struck me. And then, of course, how Genesis ends is it ends with the promise that was given to Abraham, that was passed down all the way through to Jacob, who gets renamed Israel, that now goes through Joseph because of these fortuitous circumstances that lead him into Egypt, so that Israel and Israel's descendants can survive the famine. They go into Egypt, and Egypt is like almost an incubation period, but the promise is that they will return to the land of Canaan, the land that was promised to Jacob, to Isaac, etc., etc. And so that's how Genesis ends, is that this promise is still guaranteed, that God will still be faithful, and that this will happen. And I think this is so important, because this is maybe the most important element of the book of Genesis as a singular encapsulated entity. It's written by probably a few different people, but as it's encapsulated, the button of the book, as it's ended, as a singular entity, it ends on this promise again. Most likely as the Israelites are in captivity, in Babylonian captivity at this time, who are still languishing and hoping for that return to the promised land, when they will experience the benefits and the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant, and they're reminded, don't worry, God is still on your side. God is still the narratival God that has promised to live and endure through catastrophe, and through plans that get thwarted, and through things that don't necessarily seem to go smoothly or according to the plan, but nevertheless, God is still there and is still faithful. And that's important to understand as the kind of final lines are written in Genesis before we go into Exodus, which is definitely a tonal shift, which is now we're going to get to the meat of the law of Torah as we move into Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Exodus still has some good stories. This is where we're introduced to Moses. This is where we get the Ten Commandments and all this stuff. And then moving through the civil laws, the shellfish prohibitions, and don't pierce your ears and things like that. It might get a little dry. It's been a long time again since I've gone through this, so who knows? It might be super exhilarating. But regardless, I'm going to try to make it as interesting as possible as we get into like Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. But Exodus is coming up next, and I'm sure so many of you know about the story of Moses and the parting of the Red Sea and the plagues in Egypt. So there's a lot of exciting stuff coming up here, and I'm looking forward to seeing what we might be able to extract from this. All right.